How's it going, everyone? It's Noir Tapes back with another video. Doing another plugin review. I mentioned this briefly in last week's plugin review that I was too scared to actually do this review. I decided to man up and get it done. And basically, I ended up writing a script about it. There's so many different settings in the background. There actually wasn't as many as I thought, so that was a bonus. But yeah, I ended up writing a script about it. That plugin is Cassette. This plugin is made by Waves. They make a lot of high quality plugins. I think I copped it when it was on sale at some point. If you go on the Waves website, they have all their plugins listed, and they often do sales. So I always look when there's sales and pick them up. Very high quality plugins. While I was reading the manual for this one, they talked about how they ran a bunch of tests with real cassettes in different like 4-track cassette players and all these different ones. It's pretty crazy the devotion they put in to make plugins. It's like very wild. But yeah, so let's get into it. I'm just going to break down the whole plugin first, and then I'll show you some examples, and then we'll do pricing comparisons, you know, the usual stuff. Let's go. So firstly, we'll just look at this front screen. We'll go left to right, up, down, and then we'll go into the settings button, which is the little cog up the top. That's where it gets a bit complicated. So for starters, the two obvious things I'll point out here, there's an input gain over here and an output gain over here. Pretty self-explanatory. Change the volume of the incoming signal, change the volume of the out signal. Easy peasy. And then we'll go through the 4 cassette types. If you look at the cassette that's spinning in the middle, you can see how it says type 1 up there, and it actually tells you a bit about it here. And then you've got type 2, which is written over here. This is type 3, and then type 4 up here. Just to give you a bit more information, type 1's made to emulate a ferric oxide coated cassette. They were around in the mid 1960s. Type 2 is made to emulate a chromium dioxide coated cassette in the 1970s. Type 3 is made to emulate a ferrochrome coated cassette. They were in the mid 1970s to early 1980s. And Type 4 is made to emulate a metal formulated cassette in the end of the 1970s. General rule of thumb though, if you want to keep it simple, Type 1 is meant to be the oldest, so it'll sound the worst. Type 4 is meant to be the newest, so it sounds the best. And then down the middle here, we have Pro, Home, and Micro. This is actually called the deck type, and it refers to the cassette deck that they were running tests in, right? So Pro is made to emulate the Tascam 414 4C recorder. I guess that's meant to be 4 cassettes. I'm not too sure what they mean by 4C. Might just be in the name though. And then the Micro is an Omega Reporter 20 hand recorder, which is like the quality between those two is significantly different, right? And then Home is actually just a mix of the two. So basically Pro is your best sounding, Micro is your worst sounding, Home's a mix. And then down the bottom here, we have these few knobs. The erasures knob here is made to emulate how a cassette can sound worse after it's re-recorded over a bunch of times. So with a cassette, you can record sound to it, and then you can re-record over the top of that sound. But depending on which type of deck you use, the sound can get worse over time with these re-recordings. So basically, they actually said on the Pro setting, which is the Tascam model, there wasn't actually any difference when they erased it and re-recorded it over, which is pretty impressive. But with the Micro, there was a significant difference. And the more that you re-recorded it, the worse it sounded. So it goes from 0 up to 20. And on Pro, there won't be any difference. On Home and Micro, you'll hear a bit of a difference. Spread just refers to stereo width, essentially. So normally you leave it set at 50. That's just your bass sound. 0 is mono, and 100 increases the stereo width of the sound. Stability controls the wow and flutter. In the settings up here, it goes into a bit more depth. With wow and flutter, you can do a bit more adjusting. Stability just controls it overall. And then here you have your 2 noises, as written here. Static noise and dynamic noise. These are both created when cassettes are playing. Static noise is a bit of digital noise. Dynamic is referring to the dynamic range. But you'll hear these when I'm doing examples later. And then artifacts is similar to stability. It's made to emulate artifacting that happens when cassettes are playing. You can adjust all these different artifacts in the settings tab. And this basically is like the stability control. It just controls the overall level of all the artifacts. So that's the main page done. Next we go up to the settings cog up here. And this is where it used to scare me to look at. They say in the manual that it's like simple, but honestly, when I first looked at this, I didn't even want to attempt to touch this stuff. I don't know what azimuth means, you know, intermodulation. These are all big words. It looked kind of intimidating. After doing some research, it does make a lot more sense, honestly. A lot of these words are very specific to cassettes, but once you understand it, it isn't so bad at all. And half this stuff you probably won't use unless you're really trying to mimic a cassette down to the T. So break this second screen into 4 sections, right? So in the top left you have the tape section, and then the more section down the bottom left. Top right is the stability section, and the bottom right is the artifact section. So we'll start with the tape section top left, and then we'll go down and then right down. So in the tape section, firstly we have frequency response. This enables the specific frequency responses they've tested and found between each deck and cassette type. Obviously you want that because you're trying to emulate a cassette, and it will emulate the highs and lows of each of those different frequency cassette types. You obviously want that on. Then next is saturation. This enables the saturation based on the waves analysis that they found as well. You can turn this on and off, it's up to you. It just adds tape saturation, which is always a good thing when you're trying to emulate a cassette. The compression, it just enables tape compression. It's up to you, on and off. Next is noise auto mute. I've discussed this in some of my other plugin reviews. I'll put the annotation up there as well. But quite commonly, if you turn on like static noise or vinyl noise in plugins, when you close the plugin or pause the audio, it will still keep running in the background. And this bugs me sometimes. Sometimes I don't know where the noise is coming from, and it's kind of annoying. The noise auto mute, when you turn that on, when you stop playback or close the plugin, it stops static noise and digital noise, which I love. I think that's a great feature. Then oversampling is the last one. They said if you have a saturation plugin, you should always have oversampling. I don't quite understand oversampling. What I can gather is that when you add saturation, it adds more high frequencies. That's just how it works. And oversampling basically resamples the sound at a higher sample rate the more saturation you put on it, so you can hear more of those high frequencies that are added to it. That's my interpretation. And then we'll head on down to the more section here. I don't know why they call it the more section. I guess to add more cassette related artifacting and stuff. I'm not really too sure. But either way, that's what they call it. So that's what I'll call it. So first we have crosstalk. They call it this because it's made to emulate signal leaking from one track to the other. It creates a bit of a stereo effect, and it helps glue your track together the more you add it. You can add it to taste. You can add all these things to taste, obviously. Azimuth was one of the ones I was talking about. That's like a weird sounding name. I've never heard of this thing before. What it is, according to the manual, is a variation between the two recording heads in a cassette deck. If they're slightly angled, it creates this sound. It's a bit of a unique effect. You can add it to taste if you want. Really, with a lot of these effects, I just like to have the sound going and then add it and listen to what it does, and then take it away if I don't like it, or take it away and then add it slowly until I get to an area which I like. Intermodulation. They said in the manual this is one of the artifacts that they found that they weren't expecting. They didn't know this sort of thing existed. Essentially what it does is it adds extra harmonics in the high end. They said it's not a very desirable effect. It's just a product of trying to use cassettes. They said you can add it to taste if you want. It doesn't sound great, but you can try it out. If you like it, keep it. If you're trying to be accurate with emulating a cassette, you'll have to add it, because this is one of the things they came across while they were recording, learning a bit about the frequency responses of cassettes, etc. Recassette's the next one. It's basically the same as if you stacked multiple cassette plugins with the same parameters over again. So you can do it up to 4 times, which basically is like putting 4 of these plugins one after the other. It gets a bit more CPU intensive, but it enhances all the different things you've added. So the sounds will double up, the frequency responses will double up, etc, etc. It just makes it stronger basically. And then right down the bottom, you have a mix, pretty self-explanatory. You have your dry signal coming into the plugin, you have your wet signal going out. The mix is just a mix between those two. So at 100% it's always wet, at 0% it's dry, 50% it's half and half. It gets a bit weird on cassette plugins to use the mix. They said you can use it to get quite creative sounds with a flanging effect. If you've added some of these things that add stereo information, and if you go half and half, you get this weird flanger sounding effect. But if you're trying to emulate a cassette, you should just have it on 100. No cassettes in real life are 50 mixed, you know. And then we'll go up into the stability section. All the parameters in this section feed into the stability knob on the main screen. So the more you adjust that knob, the stronger these become, essentially. So you've got wow, depth, and rate. I've talked about this in a few other lo-fi plugins as well. The wow depth is how much pitch variation is happening. The wow rate is how quickly this is happening. And then you've got flutter here. The depth and the rate are the exact same. Difference between wow and flutter. Wow is bigger and slower. Flutter's quicker and shorter. They also added a stability randomness slider here as well. Basically, in their testing, they found that it's not always the same. Like the wow's not always the same, the flutter's not always the same. It's random based on the nature of tape going through a player. So they added this, and you can adjust it to taste as well. It just adds randomness to these pitch variations. And then the last section down here, we have the artifacts section. Similar to the way the stability section works, all these feed through the artifacts knob on the main screen. So the higher that's turned up, the more this affects. The less that's turned up, the less these affects. You have the degradation depth and rate, sort of similar to how the wow and flutter works, except degradation affects frequencies. So the more depth, the more frequencies get affected, and the rate is how quickly this sort of stuff happens. And dropouts, basically imperfections on the magnets and the tape can cause dropouts really quickly. It just means that the tape just stopped, and so the depth affects how much volume's been taken away, and the rate affects how much this happens. And then random snap down the bottom, it says that sometimes the tape gets stuck, which results in a quick pitch drop, and then it fixes itself pretty quickly. Pretty much what I just talked about with dropouts. The random snap is just there to set the randomness of the artifacts essentially. And there you go. Let's do some examples, eh? So I've got a bit of a harp sample up here. I've also got a drum sample. I'll do the harp first. This is what it sounds like without cassette on at all. And so now I'm just going to go through and dirty it up real quick, make it sound like it's coming from a cassette, and then I'll be back to show you guys the finished result. So basically I just went through the plugin, added things, and tried it out, and if I didn't like it, I'd take it back, change it around. Basically I just went through, picked a cassette type first, and I put it on micro because I wanted to show you the full extent of this plugin. Pro sounds pretty good. If you're trying to make cassettes, you can pick any of these options because they're all different. They're all based on different cassette types. But I chose micro so you can see the significance of the cassette emulation you can do. And I'll also adjust the random snap when I'm showing you guys this example. That it really adds a lot of different variation to the sound. It's quite interesting. At 10%, it's pretty good. You can hear it drop occasionally, but I'll pump it up so you guys can hear what it actually does. But anyways, so this is the sound I ended up with after adjusting it. And just to remind you, this is what it sounded like before. I'm just going to turn up the random snap now so you can hear the full extent of what it actually does. But you can see how it really makes it drop and jump around really quickly. It's pretty cool. Very unique way to add to a sound, that's for sure. And now I'm going to move on to the drum sound. I'm going to do the same thing. I'll play it without first. Pretty standard drum loop, and I'm going to put it back to default and adjust it from here, and I'll show you guys after. Righto, so I just quickly adjusted it, wasn't too hard. This is what I got. And just to remind you, this is what it sounded like before. So yeah, it can really add some unique flavor to your sounds and really make it sound like it's from a cassette. It's pretty cool. Now I'll quickly do a price comparison. So this is how much cassette's going for. I looked at it in last week's video as well, $64.90. And so this is what it looks like on the page. Pretty stock standard price for a plugin these days. So I went and looked at some other ones. Obviously I discussed Tape Mellowfi last week as well. I said it was a bit overpriced for what it is. I feel like it can get better with this plugin or Sketch Cassette 2, which is the plugin I reviewed last week, which is also cheaper. But I think this is a better sounding plugin compared to Sketch Cassette. This plugin has more variety and creativity that you can do with it, and you can get a lot more accurate to cassettes as well. But Sketch Cassette 2 is definitely a plugin I would recommend if you don't have the budget for this one. I really want to try some of these other plugins out. I do think I have this plugin, but I've never really used it, so I can't give you a good comparison. but it is a little bit cheaper than cassette, so maybe pick it up if you're in between the Sketch Cassette and this one. Some of these other plugins are great. I'm really excited to buy and try some of these ones, like Analog Pro, which I might pick up here. That looks really dope, has a really cool look to it. I think I might also pick up this one, maybe this one as well. I just love picking up these tape emulation plugins. I think they're really cool. Really unique way to add flavor to sounds and take something that sounds modern and make it sound old, you know? I love doing that sort of thing. I think honestly I might pick up a few of these, maybe even this one as well. But there you go. That's the cassette review. I'm glad I got that out of the way. I was really worried about it. And after I started reading the manual, honestly, I felt a lot more confident with it. And I'm excited to use it in a lot more of my beats now. Thank you for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.